It is late at night in the highlands of Yemen. Small lamps flicker against the walls, the room feels close, and the men inside have been awake for hours. Their voices rise, soften, and rise again as they repeat sacred phrases. Cold air moves across the mountains outside. Inside the room, a dark and bitter drink passes from hand to hand, pushing sleep farther away. You take a mouthful. The taste is rough and bitter, without sugar, soft foam, a paper cup, or anyone cheerfully asking whether you would like another shot. A few minutes pass. Your eyelids still feel heavy, though keeping them open suddenly takes less effort. That room brings us close to the beginning of coffee as a prepared drink. The trail leads far from French cafés, English castles, and knights somehow eating croissants centuries before their invention. The strongest evidence takes us to the southern Arabian Peninsula, especially Yemen, near the end of the medieval period. When did medieval people begin drinking coffee? A popular answer points to someone in Ethiopia discovering that coffee berries produced energy. The surviving history has many more turns. It begins with a plant from East Africa and moves through nighttime worship, Red Sea trade, legal arguments, and crowded public rooms that made rulers nervous. Here is the first surprise. Coffee appeared during the medieval period among people living outside Europe, and its earliest documented purpose had little to do with breakfast. The familiar story begins with goats. Legend says an Ethiopian herder named Kaldi saw his goats become unusually lively after eating red berries from a shrub. He tasted the berries, felt their effect, and carried them to nearby religious men. Some versions say the monks rejected the berries and threw them into a fire, only to change their minds when the smell filled the room. Others say they immediately understood that the plant could help them stay awake. As origin stories go, it has everything: animals, chants, flames, discovery, and a hero whose goats apparently carried out the first caffeine experiment without signing a single consent form. Historical evidence is another matter. The best-known versions appeared in writing long after coffee had already spread, so the story belongs to folklore rather than a reliable timeline. The Kaldi account surfaces in later traditions, centuries after coffee drinking had taken root. It cannot identify a real person, a particular year, or a specific monastery. Ethiopian communities may still have known and used the coffee plant long before the surviving records begin. Coffea arabica grew naturally in the East African highlands, and people may have eaten the fruit, used the seeds, or prepared them in forms that left no written trace. That possibility remains open. Evidence for it remains thin. Early Ethiopian sources are scarce. Archaeology has yet to uncover an unmistakable first cup, and stories written after coffee became famous cloud the beginning. Genetic research places the original home of arabica in Ethiopia, while cultivated plants in Yemen later connected those wild origins with much of the coffee grown around the world. The plant began in one region. The drink that entered written history took shape across the sea. That difference leads us to Yemen. It also raises the question of timing. A coffee tree may grow for generations before anyone creates the full process behind a recognizable cup. The fruit needs gathering. Seeds must be separated or dried inside the fruit. Roasting may follow. Then comes crushing, heated water, brewing, and the final act of tasting the dark result and deciding, somehow, to make it again. Humans have overlooked useful plants for centuries. We have also faced plants requiring hours of work and decided that the effort seemed perfectly reasonable. The earliest persuasive evidence for coffee as a beverage comes from Yemen, across the Red Sea. The British Museum traces its early use to members of the Shadaliya Sufi order during the late 1300s or early 1400s. Many historians feel firmer ground beneath their feet by the middle or later 1400s. Sufis are Muslim mystics whose religious practice often focuses on disciplined, direct devotion. In certain communities, that devotion included long nighttime ceremonies of remembrance known as dhikr. A dhikr gathering might include repeated sacred phrases, measured breathing, movement, music, and long recitations depending on the group. Staying awake mattered because attention was part of the practice. A worshipper nodding off during the night was meeting an ordinary physical limit. The human body remains stubbornly attached to sleep. Coffee helped with that problem. Later accounts connect the drink with religious figures who moved between Yemen and the African coast. One tradition credits a Shadaliya sheikh who encountered coffee in Ethiopia and introduced a brewed preparation. Another links its spread to Muhammad al-Davani, a scholar from Aden who died around 1470. Exact names and dates require caution because the fullest accounts appeared after coffee had become widespread and controversial. The broader pattern is steadier. Coffee crossed from East Africa into Yemen, where Sufi communities helped turn it into a drink for resisting sleep. The modern routine runs in the opposite direction. Today, coffee announces morning. In late medieval Yemen, some of the earliest documented cups stretched the night. The message was closer to, "We are still praying," than "Good morning." The word itself carries marks from the journey. The Arabic term kawa once covered a wider class of drinks. Over time, it became closely attached to coffee. Arabic kawa passed into Ottoman Turkish as kahve, then moved into forms such as cafe, kafi, and coffee. Saying the word today repeats a route traveled through several languages, with each one reshaping the sound. Evidence for Sufi coffee drinking survives in a frustrating form. Small habits seldom create archives while they remain small. Worshippers gathered at night had little reason to interrupt the ceremony and record a beverage innovation for historians 500 years later. Much of the surviving account comes from 16th century authors looking backward. The most important was Abd al-Qadir al-Jaziri, who compiled an Arabic history covering coffee, its preparation, its supposed benefits, and the legal arguments surrounding it. Al-Jaziri wrote after the earliest period in his story. He gathered memories, earlier testimony, reports, and debates rather than witnessing coffee's first use himself. Even with that limitation, his work preserves a consistent memory. Coffee began in Yemen as a practice linked to Sufi devotion, then spread into everyday social life. The gaps tell us something too. Nobody can point to the first cup or name the first person who roasted the beans in a familiar way. Earlier Ethiopian communities may have brewed something similar, though the records cannot prove it. By the 15th century, coffee drinking becomes clearly visible in Yemen. Before that century ended, it had become established. Then the drink moved beyond the purpose that first made it useful. A stimulant that kept worshippers alert also helped scholars read late, merchants finish their accounts, travelers resist exhaustion, workers extend the evening, and friends continue talking. As coffee left Sufi gatherings, it entered houses, streets, markets, and other meeting places. A devotional aid slowly became a social habit. One of the clearest signs of that change is wonderfully indirect. Authorities tried to suppress it. In 1511, officials in Mecca acted against coffee and the places where people gathered to drink it. Religious law formed part of the debate. Islam prohibited intoxicants, and critics argued that coffee altered the mind or encouraged conduct associated with forbidden drinking. Defenders drew a distinction between stimulation and intoxication. Coffee kept the mind alert rather than clouding it. The sharpest anxiety surrounded the gatherings. People sat together for long periods, exchanged news, made jokes, complained, discussed trade, and sometimes talked politics. Coffee gave them a reason to remain in the room. Conversation moved freely, and supervision became harder. A drink enjoyed quietly by 3 worshippers in a distant lodge would never have attracted a public crackdown. The ban shows how far coffee had traveled by then. Trade and pilgrimage routes carried it north from Yemen into Mecca, one of the busiest meeting places in the Islamic world. Pilgrims arrived from distant regions. Merchants traded objects and information. A custom learned in the city could leave inside thousands of memories. Coffee had no advertising department. The pilgrimage network did the work. Suppression failed to settle the debate. Scholars and officials disagreed, while bans appeared, faded, returned, and were sometimes ignored. Coffee itself gradually gained acceptance as lawful. Concern shifted toward coffee houses and the conduct inside them. The British Museum records attempts to prohibit coffee in Mecca from 1511, followed later by disputes in Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul, even as the drink became part of daily life. Officials had noticed a quality that would follow cafes for centuries. Coffee changes the pace of a gathering. Alcohol can blur attention. Coffee may keep an argument alive long after everyone should have gone to bed. Medieval coffee culture varied widely. Yemen had its own customs. Mecca had others. A Sufi lodge operated differently from a market stall, and the household of a wealthy merchant bore little resemblance to a laborer's room. Preparation changed from place to place as well. Some early drinks may have used dried coffee fruit and husks, producing something closer to the Yemeni beverage now called kisher. Other preparations increasingly relied on roasted seeds that were ground and brewed. Reconstructing the transition is difficult because later descriptions can make earlier habits appear more uniform than they were. Coffee developed through trial, adaptation, and repeated tasting. Modern espresso lay far ahead. Access depended on money, custom, and the rules governing public space. Flavor alone cannot explain why the drink took hold. Wakefulness stands at the center of the earliest accounts. Religious practice gave coffee a respected purpose and encouraged repeated use. Trade supplied the raw material. Cities brought customers together. Hospitality gave the cup social value, and wealthy households turned the objects around it into displays of status. A laborer might drink coffee to fight fatigue. A scholar could use it to extend study. Merchants served it during negotiation, hosts offered it to guests, and elite families displayed imported cups or elaborate serving equipment. The plant stayed the same, its meaning shifted with the person holding the cup. This makes the usual stereotype of medieval people especially weak. They experimented with substances, borrowed habits across cultural borders, debated health, worried about morality, imitated the wealthy, and complained when younger people spent too much time socializing. The buildings change. Human behavior remains easy to recognize. Coffee houses also altered the mixture of people sharing a room. In the later Islamic coffee house, men from different trades, ethnic groups, and social ranks could sit closer together than they might inside many formal institutions. Hierarchy remained. Wealth, gender, slavery, law, class, and religion continued to shape daily life. Even so, the coffee house created a partly public room where a craftsman and a merchant might hear the same storyteller, and where information spread before officials had chosen to announce it. Most surviving accounts focus on male public life, which can make women disappear from the story. Private household habits leave fewer records than court rulings, taxes, and noisy disputes. Women prepared coffee, served it, bought it, and drank it in later periods with better documentation. The evidence from 15th century homes is too thin to describe every household with certainty. That silence matters. History preserves the worries of officials, the goods merchants taxed, and the objects wealthy people owned. A quiet cup made by an unnamed person at home is much harder to recover. Coffee traveled quickly because Yemen belonged to a densely connected world. The coffee-growing regions of Africa lay across the Red Sea. Mecca and Medina stood to the north. Shipping routes linked Arabia with Egypt, the Horn of Africa, India, and ports farther east. Overland roads carried pilgrims, cloth, spices, grain, books, and rumors. Coffee entered routes that had already been busy for centuries. The port of Al-Mocha, later known in Europe as Mocha, became so closely tied to coffee exports that its name entered the language of coffee. Today, a mocha usually combines coffee and chocolate. The port's medieval merchants had nothing to do with that order and would probably have found the whipped cream baffling. The name survived because huge quantities of Yemeni coffee once left through Al-Mocha. By the end of the 15th century, coffee drinking in Yemen had moved well beyond Shadaliya Sufi communities. During the early 16th century, it spread through the Red Sea and eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman conquests in 1516 and 1517 brought Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Cities into one imperial system. Those political changes strengthened routes along which coffee could move and be taxed. Yemeni beans traveled toward Cairo, Aleppo, Damascus, and eventually Istanbul. Here, the story changes direction. Coffee began as a regional, late medieval custom tied closely to Yemen and nighttime devotion. During the early modern period, it expanded into an urban phenomenon. Cellars appeared. Households developed rituals around serving it. Specialized workers, public shops, and tax systems followed. Coffee acquired an entire structure around the cup. Structures of that kind attract conflict. A ruler could ignore one person drinking at home and still worry about 50 men gathering around the same drink. Coffee houses hosted music, poetry, games, news, trade, and long conversation. They occupied an uncertain space between private hospitality and official public life. That room, full of people talking without permission, drew suspicion. The first Sufi cup contained the seed of that later conflict. Coffee helped a religious community maintain disciplined attention. The same wakefulness later kept public conversation alive. Its chemistry stayed constant while its place in society changed. Europe enters the story much later than popular images suggest. A traveler asking for coffee in 12th or 13th century England, France, or the German lands would receive only confusion. An inn might offer ale, wine, weak beer, herbal preparations, milk, or water of uncertain charm. A Colombian roast served by a smiling innkeeper called Geoffrey was far beyond reach. Even during the 15th century, as coffee became established in Yemen, ordinary Western Europeans had little contact with it. European physicians and travelers began describing the beverage more clearly during the later 16th century. The German doctor and botanist Leonhard Rauwolf encountered coffee during his travels in the Near East in the 1570s and published his account in 1582. The better-known coffeehouse cultures of Venice, Oxford, London, Paris, and Vienna belong mainly to the 17th century, beyond the medieval period. The claim that medieval people drank coffee only works when the medieval world is allowed to extend beyond Europe. That world included the mountain towns of Yemen, Red Sea trading cities, Islamic centers of scholarship, African kingdoms, Byzantine lands, and commercial routes stretching across continents. Coffee reveals how narrow the familiar classroom image can be. Its earliest documented drinkers lived far from the French castles and English villages that often stand in for the whole period. Placing coffee on a timeline brings another difficulty. Historians draw the medieval and early modern boundary in different places. 1500 is convenient, though nothing magical happened when the calendar turned. People did not wake on the first day of that year, announce the end of the Middle Ages, and begin acting with sudden Renaissance confidence. Coffee rests almost exactly across that uncertain boundary. Its earliest credible use belongs to the late medieval world. Its swift expansion, commercial weight, legal battles, and coffeehouse culture developed mainly during the early modern centuries. A medieval practice grew into an early modern social habit. That is why the date keeps slipping depending on the question. The first documented drinkers lead us to 15th century Yemen. Widespread use in major cities pushes the answer into the 16th century. Daily European coffee culture points mainly toward the 17th. One drink carries 3 timelines. The clearest sequence begins with the plant growing in Ethiopia. Through routes that remain partly hidden, it crosses into Yemen. By the 15th century, people there are preparing a stimulating drink. Sufi communities use it during nighttime devotion. The custom enters ordinary life. Merchants and pilgrims carry it north. Officials object. Shops open. Empires discover that it can be taxed. Europeans encounter it, import it, and later create coffee houses of their own. None of those people needed to understand caffeine as a chemical. They understood what happened after drinking it. Sleep moved farther away. Attention sharpened. Warmth spread through the hands. The cup filled a pause and gave people another reason to stay together. Coffee survived arguments over health, religion, expense, luxury, waste, and public order because it answered several needs at once. It fought fatigue, supported hospitality, relieved boredom, softened loneliness, and filled the uneasy silence before business began. It also answered an ancient desire, keeping the night alive for a little longer. The date depends on which medieval population we are talking about. Across the wider medieval world, coffee drinking was established by the 15th century and may reach back into the late 1300s or early 1400s. Yemen provides the strongest early evidence. Arabica came from East Africa, while the recognizable brewing tradition became visible across the Red Sea among Yemeni communities, especially Sufis. By the late 15th century, coffee had moved beyond those circles. Among medieval Europeans, coffee remained almost entirely unknown. A small number of travelers may have encountered it near the close of the period or soon afterward. Everyday European coffee culture came later. The precise beginning remains hidden. The first brewer has no name. Evidence cannot show whether an older Ethiopian preparation closely resembled the drink made in Yemen, or how many failed attempts disappeared before anyone thought the process worth repeating. The untidy history is richer than the legend. Somewhere between the forests of East Africa and the towns of Yemen, people learned that drying, heat, crushing, and hot water could turn an unpromising seed into something powerful. A religious community found a purpose for the drink. Trade carried it outward. Conversation ensured that people kept asking for more. Return to the room in Yemen. The lamps continue burning. Voices fill the close air. A cup moves from hand to hand, valued as a defense against sleep rather than a fashionable luxury. The men in that room cannot imagine the ports, cafés, offices, kitchens, and morning commutes waiting in the centuries ahead. They know only that the night is long. Their work continues, and the bitter drink makes staying awake easier. Coffee entered history during the night. Someone needed to keep their eyes open.